Emergencies affect individuals, don't they? There's what happens on the day might be a very frightening experience. It might not be a frightening experience. I mean, at a minimum, it'll be stressful. And then there's everything that takes place afterwards. But everybody, whether they know it or not, is a part of a community. They live within a community. And I know something that you and I have both come to see very, very clearly is that there's very much a community process of recovery after a big event. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I've had the privilege of really visiting communities at different stages, even 10 or 20 years later sometimes, and also going through those early stages with many different communities, probably more than 100. And I think there are some very predictable processes that are kicked off. And when I've given presentations on this in training situations, I've had people come up to me and say, this is exactly what happened to my workplace when one of our colleagues had a heart attack and died on the office floor. Or this is exactly what happened to my family when we had a child die of leukemia. There are all sorts of different tragedies, but we need to understand that trauma disrupts the social system that the people are involved in. And I think the first thing that happens, if you start with the fact that people are in a social system, a structure, they know where they fit, they've got relationships and roles, and they know how they all interact with each other. They've got routines, they do things in a predictable way, which means they don't have to give any thought to these. They're all absolutely predictable. And then something happens and everybody's put under threat. They go into the adrenaline mode, this total focus on how do I survive? Maybe I'll help the people near me, but it's just me and, I don't know, me and the gunman, me and the bushfire, me and the earthquake. And when that happens, nothing else matters except me and the problem. I can think of a woman who told me when the Christchurch earthquake hit, she and her husband leapt out of bed and they went into 2 different bedrooms with the 2 different children. And all sorts of things happened in the house, things fell down and so on. And for quite a long time, it seemed to them, they had no idea what had happened to the partner and the other child. Now, when you're in adrenaline, a few moments feels like hours and has a profound effect. So this is the sort of thing that happens. Now, because you're in that high focus and totally targeted on the problem, it's like all of your connections just momentarily evaporate, only momentarily. I call that the moment of debonding. And it's like suddenly there's a moment of just me and the problem. And as soon as that comes to an end, you survive, you come out the other end, things stabilise. That sense of disconnection is terribly disturbing and painful because most of us have never felt that before. And so we rebound into a state of intense connectedness. I'm so glad you're alive. You fall into each other's arms. You stagger out of the fire. I know the man who picked up driving through a bushfire, not knowing that he or his kids would survive, and they saw somebody staggering along. They opened the door and he jumped in, and they drove through. And when they got out, he embraced and said, "Thanks, mate, thanks." And he said, "I'll be right now." And he got out of the car, and he never saw him again. He had no idea who this person was. He had saved his life. It's like this. There are these connections that are completely different from the normal process of relationships. Yes. And they cut to the absolute core of human values. You alive, you're another human being. I care about you, we help each other. Most people will do whatever they can to help those. And so the rebound reveals those wonderful human values, but we lose separateness, we lose distance, we lose privacy. People throw their homes open. Supermarkets open their doors and invite people to take whatever they need after a bushfire. many different stories of the suspension of the normal rules and regulations that order society. Now, that's a very positive thing in the short term, but actually it leads very predictably to people being deeply emotionally engaged with each other, and they're all expressing their emotions with each other, and they're all over-involved with each other because they've lost their privacy. They don't care whether they've never met each other. They're telling their absolute core experiences. They're falling in each other's arms. Look, there are pictures of prime ministers embracing people.
I was going to say, we see this so clearly on the news, you know, in the early aftermath of an emergency or a disaster. You know, we see all the community members coming together, hugging each other, as you were talking about just there, people manning barbecues for days, weeks, months at a time. You know, as you say, it's a really, really positive early stage or early phase of community recovery.
And sometimes very senior political leaders will go there and they'll be deeply moved and they'll embrace people. And I've even known them to give them their card and say, look, if there's anything I can do, you can ring me. Here's my number.
Everybody gets caught up in it.
It's like it's a short circuit straight to the top.
Yeah.
And so what you get is something very different from normal society, where you ask the question, well, hang on, who's telling me this? And do they actually know? And what qualifications do they have? And so we get this environment that flows out of this state of fusion of people all communicating emotionally with their emotionally charged agendas. So we get rumours, myths, judgments, opinions that are often based on very fragmentary information, but people are absolutely sure it's right. And I'm sure it's right because my mate Dave told me and he wouldn't lie.
This is where we can start to see problems.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so if the community gets too deeply in this, there comes a time when suddenly we realise, hang on, it's a bit more complicated. Me and Dave were together here in this because we went through this and survived, so we're together. And suddenly I realised, hang on a second, he's insured and I'm not. Or he qualifies for a certain sort of assistance and I'm not. And suddenly that emotionality can switch from being positive to negative. And therefore what we see is as the different effects of the disasters unfold, and the essence that we've learned is you cannot identify the consequence of a person's life from a disaster with the amount of material loss they had. It's much, much more complicated. Yeah. And so there comes a time when people start to feel angry and bitter. And then if we're all gossiping to each other, all the people that belong to one group will start to feel angry with all the people that belong to another group, like people who qualified for something and people who didn't. There'll be opinions about whether people have got things whether they deserve or not, because I don't think they deserve it. And I call these cleavage planes. Like in a diamond, there's a certain plane in the crystal that can split. It's like suddenly this, what seemed so cohesive, can split and cause a lot of angst. And I know that people have told me regularly they've lost long-standing friendships here because they happen to fall on either side of a disaster issue. So
what are then some of the things that people can do, you know, or that community can do in this sort of, I guess, early phase to try to head off or prevent some of these big issues or problems cropping up further down the track?
This is so important that people look beyond, and particularly those responsible for the recovery process, look beyond individuals and try and see the community systems. They need to be organised so that there's some order and some predictability. We need to regain some of the structures that have been designed. You know, local government and state government and federal government, they've all got their roles, all the different professions. They've all been designed to meet our needs. And so we have to get in very early before people have sort of settled. Because when they're in that initial turmoil of saying, well, what are we supposed to be doing? Who's looking after us? And if you get in there and say, I'm here, we haven't got all our people here, but we're on the way, then they'll say, oh, yeah, right, okay, we'll lock onto you. But if you don't do that, they'll say, oh, we've got to do this ourselves. And they'll actually put a kind of skin around the community. And then when the professionals come in and say, we're here, they say, well, where were you? You know, we can do this ourselves. But they can't. They will come to grief later. But, you know, so I'd say it's very important to get in there early and start organising and ordering things and helping people realise there are multiple different kinds of problems, multiple different qualifications, and then sending out messages like, you don't need to worry about who got financial assistance or who didn't. If somebody else got it, that doesn't mean you're not going to get it.
Yeah.
It's not one bucket of money. If you've got the entitlement, you'll get it. And this is your taxes. Don't say, oh, no, give it to some, give it to Rob because he's a poor old guy, he really needs it more than me. No, there'll be plenty for everybody. And so bring order and take things away from emotion to an orderly process. And that's what I think of as a constructive differentiation. Break up this plum pudding of a fusion into a community that's organised around the tasks.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can see a really important link here then because, and I know we've both seen this as well many times, but now the research is sort of starting to back it up. So if you don't have that order, you have disorder. You know, if you don't have organisation, you end up with disorganisation. And as you were explaining a moment ago, what were once good relationships and connections can start to break down and become negative. You know, you had a great relationship with a neighbour, but there's some sort of point of difference opens up and you end up not liking each other. Yes. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's research now from around the world that shows very clearly in the aftermath of disasters, one of the biggest things, if not the biggest things, that contributes to successful community recovery is the nature of the connections or the relationships between the people in the community. And so they need to be positive, good, supportive connections and relationships, and that it comes through, doesn't it, that the communities that have that or kind of have more of it tend to get through much better. You know, they might avoid some of the big pitfalls and completely breaking down. And this sort of issue of close relationships and connectedness actually seems to stand over and above everything else. You know, the amount of money that people might get or access to services. It's such an important and interesting point because it just brings it all back to community and how important community and cohesive community is.
It's the very thing we take for granted in our ordinary life, the fact that we are in communities. And so, as you say, this research shows that the relationships people have within their community is the best predictor of how fast and how complete their recovery will be. Not the amount of money that's spent or the number of visits from politicians and so on, or the amount of concrete that's poured, but the quality of relationships. And so therefore I think it's so important that the community is helped to understand they need to take care of each other and try and get out of this adrenaline mode, because our brains will always be judgmental in that state, to take care of each other. And we know that people who belong to organisations will meet and talk. And it's that talking that helps them self-reflect and become aware of their needs.
Yeah, so I think, Rob, it's really important for people to understand how community can best support its own recovery. You know, maybe you could talk a bit about that.
I think the most important thing is for the community to be helped to organise itself, to have representatives that can speak for the community needs. Governments will never get it right if they don't take input from communities, for the very simple reason that governments have to do a lot of things after disaster they usually don't do, so they're never going to be experienced in it. And so therefore the whole principle of which we now have in Australia and Victoria about community-led recovery and the need for communities to develop their own organisation to advise governments.
Yeah, the voice of community.
Yes. and that these networks that then form as that organisation representing the community talks to the community, you create all these opportunities to speak about what they need and what they're experiencing. They become the informal networks that distribute the information and also then feed in the needs. And one of the most important things is that people feel confident in their recovery and optimistic about the future when they feel that there's a clear recognition that the government gets it, that the supportive agencies that are coming in understand what we need, that they're working together and coordinated. And then I can say, we're in good hands, it's going to be all right. Yeah. And these are often symbolic events. Yeah. And people have told me that it's so important that somebody picks up these social tensions and tries to work with them and bring forward the goodwill that everyone has, even if it's not properly aligned.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there's, probably also that one other really important additional issue, well, not issue, but that thing that communities can do to support their own recovery, which this relates to all of the community-related activities and events that bring people out of their homes and bring them together and create an opportunity for people to, form connections or strengthen connections, but also, and really importantly, to just talk about what's happening for them in their life.